Greetings from Hopalong Hollow. This is Jerry, and we've been joined today by the girls who have been helping me choose the perfect herbs to go in the colonial herb garden that we started in the last video. When it comes to planting herbs, you couldn't ask for better advice than to ask a rabbit, because they really know about these things. So I'm going to tell you the things that we've chosen, where they're going in the garden, and the reason we've chosen them. Then we're going to go ahead and start some of our seeds in these little pelleted trays, which are just an excellent way, especially for a beginner, to start your seedlings in the house. But before we get started talking about the seeds, let's go ahead and get these little pellets ready to go, because the first thing you need to do is get them wet with some nice warm water, because you want these little peat pots to expand. And while we're discussing the herbs, we'll just go ahead and let these little pots expand. It doesn't take too long. And put those aside. So the important thing is to choose what you love. This is your garden. This is my garden, and you have your own garden. So you're going to want to choose the things that you like to eat, or the things that you like the look of, or maybe you just like the scent of something. In the case of this garden, of course, we're doing this in more of a, like I said, a more of a formal manner. So I do want a lot of compact plants to make these separating lines, and therefore going along here in this crisscross across the garden, I found something called Bush Spicy Globe Basil. Number one, I love the scent of basil. I love the taste of basil. And this one only grows 10 to 15 feet tall, and I think it would make a wonderful little grouping all along the edges here if it grows in that nice compact manner. Now, of course, I'll have to keep it trimmed down in order to keep it nice and round like this, but I think that is going to be very beautiful. Now, something that grows in a little more wild fashion would be cilantro and parsley, which I love to put in our salads. And so those I think I'm going to place in these corners, the parsley here, the cilantro here. And then I'm also going to get some chives. I have so many chives growing around here. I'm going to dig up some little chive bulbs, and I'm going to use those in a nice little fashion here along these corners, which actually have bricks. cordoning them off in each corner. So parsley, cilantro, and all along the edges, little lines of chives. I found this little section here, which has got a lot of gritty soil in it, because this is where the sidewalk used to be. It was a gravel sidewalk, but when I mixed it in with the soil, I've got some nice gritty soil, very great for drainage. So I thought maybe 3 lavender plants here along the front, and those I will not plant from seed. I just don't have any luck with them. But when it's time to get little bedding plants, I will go pick out 3 lovely lavenders and put them right here. I've also chosen a dark basil with dark leaves, just for a lovely contrast with the bright greenery that we have going on in the garden. I like thyme because it's more of a creeping plant. Not sure where it's going in here yet, but we will definitely find a place for it. Here's another basil, which is cinnamon basil, and also not for sure where that's going to go yet. So everything can change. You don't have to have everything exactly right. Until you start getting your plants in, you don't even know what's going to grow for you yet. So it's kind of a hit and miss situation. But one thing I want to definitely put in this garden, because I absolutely love it, and it's not an herb, it is a lettuce. It is an arugula, my very favorite green in the world to put in a salad, and it kind of grows along the ground, but then when it starts sprouting up, it's got a lot more nice compact look to it. So I'm thinking about doing the arugula just in patches here and there, and maybe spinach as well. Arugula in particular in this back area, because this is gets a little more shade. It's a little cooler here because the pergola is right here. So this is my plan so far, and I hope that you're working on yours as well. There's still other things I want to put in here. I really want some rosemary. I want some catmint and some marjoram. So it's a small space, but we can pack an awful lot into this little rectangular space here. So we'll see what happens. And now let's get going on some seeds. And as I get along, I'm actually doing a little more formal look here with the garden. This will be the first thing that comes up, and these daffodils. Be sure to read the back of your package to see when you should be planting these in the house, because you really don't want to do this too early, and you don't want to do it too late. So check out when your last frost date will be in your area. And in our area, these begin to grow in the garden in April and July. So I think this is just about the right time for me to be putting these in. Be sure to mark your plants, your seeds, so you know what you've got growing in there and the date that you put them in. And I'd like to show you what we accomplished outside in the colonial herb garden. As far as the groundwork goes, I did get a little bit done. So thank you, girls, for your help. It's always good to have a rabbit on hand when you need advice on planting herbs. And today we are actually going to be talking about a woman who became quite famous the world over and is still famous to this day because of a little rabbit that she created. And that little rabbit would be the infamous Peter Rabbit. So today, that's right, we're having tea with Beatrix Potter. Welcome to our Beatrix Potter afternoon tea. I don't think you've been properly introduced to some of our guests here. This is Mrs. Whiskerkins, Miss Bunwinky, and the lovely Miss Fuzzyfoot. These ladies are fans and aficionados of all things Beatrix Potter, in particular Peter Rabbit, as you can well imagine. Always keep in mind when you have special guests that you want to cater to their individual tastes, and in this case we are serving a lot of fresh greens and delicious fruits for the Hopalong Hollow buns. We might be joined a little later by some mice. You never can tell. Today the ladies will be enjoying chamomile and lavender herbal tea. And this is by Harney and Sons, one of my favorite companies, of course. You probably already know that. And these come in wonderful tea bags. As soon as you open that can, you just get that wonderful scent of chamomile. And the girls are drinking their tea out of this lovely little set of Beatrix Potter porcelain, made in Germany by M.W. Ritter since 1948. So we'll let that steep. And as we do, we'll talk a little bit about the founder of our tea today, Beatrix Potter. Beatrix Potter was born in 1866 in London to a wealthy family. The Potter wealth was not old money. It was actually acquired by the hard work and industry of Beatrix's paternal grandfather, who bought a run-down textile mill and turned it into a great success. They created hand-printed calico, which was very popular at the time, and in fact, at a later date, when Beatrix became quite well known, one of the prints that she became very fond of and wanted to use in some of her artwork happened to be originally printed by her grandfather's textile company. So Beatrix grew up with a rather comfortable life with her younger brother Bertram, with nannies, private school teachers, but she had an aptitude for art from a very young age and a great love for nature and animals. There have been so many books written about Beatrix Potter that I'm just going to skim over the surface things and tell you a few of the things that I know about her. And one of the reasons she became one of the most beloved illustrators of all time. Pretty remarkable thing that her books are still being printed over 100 years after the first printing of Peter Rabbit. But she had a lot of contemporaries as well. There were many, many other people, wonderful artist names that you would recognize, that were doing books at the same time that she was. And I'd like to do a video on that sometime, but today we're talking about Beatrix Potter. So, by the way, you and I are drinking peppermint herbal caffeine-free tea today, also made by Harney and Sons. And you'll find this to be extremely pepperminty and very, very good. I did not grow up knowing about Beatrix Potter. I did not know about Beatrix Potter until I had children myself and discovered all the wonderful little books that she had. And this is only a very small helping of them, because the original set that I had, which I read to my children, I recently gave away to my son, who had a little baby, and I wanted his family to grow up with Beatrix Potter as well, because there's such wonderful art, such wonderful stories, such delicate and natural illustration that it really has been a huge influence on my artwork and my stories as well. All these years. Beatrix Potter was 16, she started a diary, and this is how we know quite a bit about her life and her childhood and her upbringing. Her father was very encouraging in her art, her mother not so much. From what I've gathered, her mother was rather strict and distant, but her father was very warm. He was also quite an established artist in his own right and collected a lot of art from famous people, and they actually were friends with many of the famous artists of the time. Beatrix's speciality really at that time was nature. She loved fungi, flora and fauna, and did a lot of nature studies as a young girl. Beatrix was 6 years old. The family would take trips up to the North Country and Scotland, and this is where her true joy and interests in art really came to fruition. Here's Beatrix as a young girl. This really was a place that she loved. It appears her brother had quite an aptitude for art too. This was a drawing he did up in the North Country when he was only 7 years old. I'd say that's pretty good for a 7-year-old, actually. In London, Beatrix and Bertram spent a lot of time up in their so-called nursery, which was really more like a little art studio, actually, where they had many little animals. They had mice and rats and rabbits and even bats. Bertram had a very special bat right here. And when he had to go off to school at one point, leaving the bat as the responsibility for Beatrix, and it wasn't doing so well, he wrote a letter back to Beatrix saying, "I am sorry to hear the news of the bat. If he cannot be kept alive, as I suppose he can't, you had better kill him and stuff him as well as you can. Be sure to take his measurements most carefully before you stuff him." And on and on and on it goes. And in the end it says, "I should not do too much at its head, as it can't smell much." But just look at the drawings and the illustrations on the outside of this letter. Beatrix's initial leanings as an artist were not geared really toward doing storybooks. What she really wanted to do was botanical illustration, and she was really quite good at it. Unfortunately, at that time period, I should say fortunately, because if she had become well known for this or had gotten this as her occupation, Peter Rabbit would never have come into being, or Jemima Puddle Duck, or Jeremy Fisher, or any of those other little wonderful characters. But these were some of her botanical drawings. But at that period of time, a woman was not welcome into that world, and therefore Beatrix realized she would have to go on to other avenues with her art. As you can see, it's really quite beautiful. I guess Beatrix realized that her dreams of becoming a botanical illustrator were not going to come to fruition. So she took to illustrating greeting cards, and these were some of her first Christmas cards, just absolutely beautiful. You can see the beginnings here of the storybooks just by these lovely rabbits. Aren't they just charming as can be? Her first check was for £6 for some of her designs for Christmas cards. I appreciate you ladies being so quiet and attentive during our discussion on Beatrix Potter. Thank you so much. In 1893, Beatrix said, "I have a new young rabbit named Peter." And here you can see an illustration of Peter, because Beatrix Potter did use live animals for models. She actually had quite a menagerie, and they were pets, and they were beloved pets. Everything from mice and rats to bats. But in one case, she had to borrow a guinea pig from a neighbor, Mrs. Paget. And here's something I find very delightful and humorous that she wrote in her diary. "First I borrowed and drew Mr. Chops, and I returned him safely. And then, in an evil hour, I borrowed a very particular guinea pig with a long white ruff, known as Queen Elizabeth. This wretched pig took to eating blotting paper, pasteboard, string, and other curious substances, and expired in the night. But Miss Paget proved peaceable. I gave her the drawing." I just think that's So funny and delightful. And you know, that is the way she actually wrote. When she started doing her stories, she had a certain way about her, kind of like a dry humor, which I really love. How did Beatrix Potter go from botanical art to greeting card illustration to storybooks? Well, it all started with a little letter. Beatrix's old governess, who was now Mrs. Moore, she had 4 children, and they were actually very fond of Beatrix, and she visited them quite often. Well, one of Mrs. Moore's children, Noel Moore, became very ill, and Beatrix wanted to cheer him up. So she wrote him a letter that said, "I don't know what to write to you, so I shall tell you a story about 4 little rabbits whose names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter." And so begins the story of Peter Rabbit, which first appeared as a little letter written to a sick child. This is an actual copy of the original letter from Beatrix Potter. Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Beatrix Potter said in 1900, "For the next few years I continued to accept commissions for illustrations, but I knew what I really wanted to do was publish a storybook of my own, one that my little friends would enjoy." And to make a long story short, Beatrix borrowed back the copy of the letter from Noel Moore, and she turned it into a little book. After countless rejections from publishing companies, she decided to do something very unusual at the time, especially in those years of the early 1900s, and Beatrix Potter published the book herself. She was one of the first self-published author illustrators. I love that. As a matter of fact, when I did my first book and I learned that Beatrix Potter had been self-published her first book as well, I said, well, if it's good enough for Beatrix, it's good enough for me. And I also self-published my first book back in 2005. But this is a copy of the original Beatrix Potter book. It was not in color. It was simply ink drawings like this, just little line drawings, but absolutely charming nevertheless. And this was very, very successful. She published 250 copies of this book. Little book for 250 copies cost Beatrix £17. And she said they have printed it rather nicely. And I just happen to agree. I think it looks very charming. Now, eventually, a publisher did take this on, and that was Warren Company, but they required that she paint these and turn these into little watercolor paintings, and we're all so glad that she did, because they are so beautiful when they are in color. I know what size the originals were of Beatrix Potter's work, if they were true to the size of the book, but these are some of the little proofs from the first printing, and aren't we glad that they requested she do these in watercolor. Another note from Beatrix, which says, in 1903, "The Tale of Peter Rabbit was a great success, and to my delight the publishers were willing to consider a second book. And as we know, one book followed another, and another, and another, and Beatrix became quite wealthy and quite famous the world over." The odd thing is, her parents didn't really like this kind of wealth, because despite the fact that they came from tradespeople, they didn't like tradespeople. They actually looked rather down on tradespeople, and this really was not the avenue that they wanted their daughter to take. However, she proved to be a really astute businesswoman, and from her books came board games and dolls, and stuffed animals, and china sets, and all manner of merchandising, all because of her ideas. I love this little blurb in a newspaper of the time. It says, "The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Miss Potter to be heartily congratulated on her book. In these days when so much trash for children is published, it is a boon to parents to come across a child's book of genuine humor. The Tale of Peter Rabbit is a model of what a children's picture book should be. And actually, I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, even to this day. And maybe that's why Beatrix Potter's books are still famous the world over. In hundreds, a young woman was really under the thumb of her family, and she wasn't really encouraged to be independent. And this is a perfect example right here in this letter that she wrote in her diary. I am very much vexed. Mr. Warne, one of the publishers, arranged for me to visit his sister-in-law in Sunbilton so that I could draw her little girl's dollhouse, but Mamma did not want me to go and made such difficulties that I had not enough spirit to say anything. I should be very sorry if Mr. Warne thought me uncivil. The Mr. Warne that she's referring to in this diary entry was Norman Warne, and Norman was the youngest brother in the company, and he was in charge of Beatrix books. So they worked closely together, talking about stories and artwork and book layout and all the things that you would talk about with your artist and your publisher. And in the end, they actually fell in love with one another and decided to get married, which would have been very disagreeable to Beatrix's parents. Agreeable, in fact, that Beatrix had determined that she would not even announce her engagement for 6 months, hoping her parents would change their mind about Mr. Warne. Unfortunately, Beatrix was never able to announce her engagement because Norman, after a very short illness, died in September of 1905, leaving Beatrix with a broken heart. Norman's death, Beatrix packed up her paintbrushes and her sorrows, and she headed back up to the North Country, to the Lake District where she had been so happy as a child, and really discovered her love of nature and art firsthand, a place where she'd always been really happy. And it was there that she purchased her first piece of property, Hilltop Farm. Here's Beatrix in the doorway of Hilltop Farm, and it hasn't changed since that time. You can still visit Hilltop Farm, and millions of people do every year visit Beatrix Potter's. She never actually did live in this house, but she did restore it, and she made it into something of a museum of her artwork and her furniture, and often used it in her illustrations in her future books, which she continued to illustrate and write. There's a better photograph of Hilltop Farm. The interior of the house, of Beatrix's gardens, and the landscape in the Lake District can be seen in many of her books. So I'm going to jump right ahead and tell you the end of the story, although the story never really ended because her books are alive to this very day. But at the age of 47, Beatrix married William Heelis. He was a respected, very quiet gentleman and a local solicitor. He had helped her acquire much of her land, and the land that she acquired turned out to be quite a bit, because her idea was to preserve these properties and just maintain and conserve the unique country landscape of the Lake District. Great example of her having used the interior of the hilltop in one of her illustrations. There's Tabitha Twitchett. Her life really changed when she moved into the Lake District, and she took on gardening and farming, and she actually began to breed sheep. An ancient breed of sheep called Herdwick. She became quite renowned, actually, in the area. Not for her books, but for her sheep breeding. This is Hilltop Farm. Beautiful. Look at that cottage garden, as you can see. Because of her gardens They often appeared in the illustrations in her books, which she continued to do until her eyesight gave way. I believe the last book she did was in 1930. When Miss Potter married, she insisted on being known as Mrs. William Heelis, and no longer wanted to go by the name of Beatrix Potter. In the end, Beatrix Potter had become quite a country woman, a gardener, a farmer, a sheep breeder, a wife, and she continued, as I said, to do books until her eyesight gave way. And Beatrix Potter died at the age of 77 in 1943 of pneumonia. One of the reasons her legacy lives on is because of a remarkable action that she took before her death. Of Beatrix Potter's death in 1943, she had acquired 14 farms and 4,000 acres, all of which she left to the National Trust. I think that, in and of itself, is enough to keep the legacy of Beatrix Potter going. Well, I venture to say that many people, maybe even most people, don't really know about the history and the story of Beatrix Potter. What they love were her books. What they love is the artwork. What they love are the characters, the delicate watercolor paintings, the personality that she was able to put into every single little painting. Just remarkable how absolutely beautiful they are. Difficult for me to say which is my favorite Beatrix Potter story because I just love every single one of them. I know that my boys, when they were little, they loved The Tale of Jeremy Fisher, which is absolutely hilarious, really. There's Jeremy Fisher. But one of my favorites was always Jemima Puddle Duck. And it's one of the reasons I loved her stories, because although her animals were anthropomorphic, they had their true natures. This fox is truly being what a fox is. He wants to eat the duck. The duck is truly being what she is. She's a foolish, silly little character. I know this because I've had ducks for 15 years. I know what they're like. But I absolutely love, and everything still has a happy ending nevertheless. But I just love the way that she gave them their true natures, and she didn't beat around the bush with the facts of life when it came to their bad points and their good points. And I love her way with language. So if you're familiar with the Jemima Puddle Duck, you know that the fox has fooled Jemima into laying her eggs in his special little shed. And here's what he says. He said he loved eggs and ducklings. He should be proud to see a fine nestful in his woodshed. Jemima Puddle Duck came every afternoon as she laid 9 eggs in the nest. They were greeny white and very large. The foxy gentleman admired them immensely. He used to turn them over and count them when Jemima was not there. The shed was almost quite full of feathers. It was almost suffocating, but it was comfortable and very soft. Jemima Puddle Duck was rather surprised to find such a vast quantity of feathers, but it was very comfortable, and she made a nest without any trouble at all. Silly Jemima Puddle Duck, but all of her characters just came alive. They were so very charming. Of course, this has a happy ending because Shep the dog comes in and saves the day. But I'd be interested to know if you have a favorite Beatrix Potter story. Share it with us. Let us know in the comments. So I know I've let this video go on far too long, and I really have just scratched the surface of anything Beatrix Potter. But if you want to know more about her, there are so many books, and you can see some of them right here. And the book that I have been using throughout this video, with all those wonderful little letters and the books and the diary, is Beatrix Potter, a journal. And I'm pretty sure you can still find this on Amazon. And my cookbook that I used, the Beatrix Potter Country Cookery Book, you can find that used on Amazon as well. I'd love to make some more recipes from this book, and I'm pretty sure we will in the future. So for now, thank you for having tea with us today. Our teas were from Harney & Sons, both herbal teas, peppermint herbal, and actually I think I prefer the chamomile and lavender. What a beautiful light and airy taste it has. But you can just taste that little hint of lavender and a big hint of chamomile. And so the girls and I would like to thank you for joining us today. Ladies, say goodbye. Goodbye, ladies. And we'll see you next time in Hopalong Hollow. This is Jerry.